Good morning from my living room, or should I say good afternoon actually. Well, it might be morning where you are. This is 4046, and this is, I'd like to call it maybe a bonus video for today. As I do these are getting a little bit easier and easier to do, and framing shots is getting easier and easier as well. I call this my mega-sode video, and saying a lot less. I mean, I'm not trying to commune or meditate. Anyhow, I'd like to talk about what it was like in the 80s, but from a standpoint of analog technology. If you were born before the year 2000, then some of you younger selves will not realise it's not always been like this. I was a child in a time when we didn't really, mobile phones were only for people, investment bankers and people in the city. These phones were enormous. We're talking about something that makes a smart speaker even look small. These things had massive aerials on them, and they were extendable aerials, so every time you wanted to make a call you had to get the aerial out and then fold the aerial back in. There was no digital displays, it was just literally a number pad and then the possibly couple of hundred, maybe 1,000 phone numbers in the world, mobile phone numbers in the world at that time. I think it all came from the military, because they needed phones in the 70s and 80s to get through to battlefield command, so I think that's where it came from. Anyhow, enough about phones. Back then you only had several different types of media. You had for computers floppy disks, and some of these were huge. So you had 8.5 inch, 5.5 inch, and then later on the harder plastic ones, the 3.5 inch. Because back in the day, you didn't have massive hard drives, and the hard drives were like compared to now, are absolutely enormous, absolutely huge, pretty much a prominent doorstop. And back then also you had tapes. Tapes were used quite a lot for many years. The greatest thing about a tape is you could make a mixtape. It's not so easy on CD. CDs came about back in the early 80s, and they didn't really get to prominence until maybe the late 80s, where you could fit an entire album on a CD. So CDs sound quality was very good. The only difference is if you got a scratch on a CD you couldn't sort it out, whereas if your tape furled up a bit you could just use a pencil to wind it back. Quite ingenious really, to be honest. And tapes were sort of harder wearing than a CD, so you could take tapes anywhere and use them mostly for music. I think some people used dictaphones with tapes in them, but that's neither here nor there. Today your phone would be a dictaphone. Everything, quite a lot of things from back then would all be in your phone now. So back then you had basic computers, no, there was no internet, and there was no social media. It was completely different to the way it is today. And unfortunately social media is both good and bad in many different reasons. But this was a time where you'd phone your mate on your landline or something, say you're coming out today, yeah, no, whatever, and then at that point didn't even have text messages. You didn't have I think the most sort of instant way of talking to each other was through like something called a CB radio, where you got like a little aerial, and you had to have a license for it, and you had to talk to various people. Well, obviously people you knew. You could make new friends on there, but it's highly unlikely you would ever meet them. CB radios came about because truckers and lorry drivers used to get lonely in their cabs, so it was fun to talk to somebody on the other side. I mean, back then as well, you had these massive hi-fi systems. You had something called with like there'd be in several sections. You'd have one section for records, so that would be the turntable on the top. You'd have a double tape deck, and then if you were snazzy enough, you'd have a CD player, and these were connected to two massive speakers. I mean, I was sort of exposed to it because my dad listened to a lot of records and CDs, and he was quite enthusiastic in his music. He didn't make music, admitted that he was a consumer of music. But like him, I developed some of my musical tastes thanks to him. And then I found other things as well. That's why I've got to my side hundreds of CDs. Unfortunately, at the moment, I've got nothing to play them with, but I'm working on it. I want to get a boom box with a digital radio. Boom boxes, again, in the 80s, you had these big boom boxes where you needed to be a weightlifter to carry them because they're so massive and heavy. And they used to have tape decks on them as well. You used to sort of take them wherever, and they needed millions of batteries because they're not energy efficient like they were today. They almost like needed their own generator. And then you also have back then as well, although it's not so common today, something called pirate radio stations, where somebody could have a transmitter and they would put out illegally, because you hadn't need a license to have a radio station, especially in this country anyway, and then put out all sorts of things, and then people chasing them to try and give them fines and put them away for it, even though they weren't breaking the law as such. They just had an audience for their transmissions. But anyway, I digress. Back then, in this country, you only had 4 channels on TV. You had channels BBC 1, BBC 2, ITV, and Channel 4. That's all you had. I mean, if you were lucky and you were well off, you could have like cable and satellite, but it wasn't the same as it is today. Things like magazines, newspapers, all that kind of stuff, which are starting to go away now, but they were really prevalent back then. You could do all sorts of things. They also used to run competitions, not like you get today, YouTube giveaways and things like that. It was just completely different. For those of you that grew up in the 80s, I'm sure you'll agree, as much as there was the element of the Cold War hanging over our heads until 1989, I wasn't really aware of it because obviously I was quite young then, but it's one of those things that a whole generation may have known about, and we were the first generation to know what it was like to visit these countries where before you couldn't. There was Eastern European countries which were Soviet run, and you could visit them, but they weren't as open as they are today. Unfortunately, there's a lot of problems with some of the things that are going on currently, which I will not go into now because it falls into the world of politics, and as I said, one of my ground rules is no politics. Anyway, I was sort of quite happy with the way things are going. If you have any suggestions, I can still make tons of videos. These are getting easier and easier to do. At a later date, I will start having a bit more props to show you exactly what I mean, as sort of learn to try and edit these things, because as always, this is the learning curve, as I said in my first video. Thank you for your support, and to any new people, please subscribe and like. This is 4046 out.